Kupo Moogles, it's TheShwantz27 here with a recap of Week 1 for the Coliseum 2 tournament. After the Grand Melee portion of the event gave us Terra's Sword to separate the top 32 gladiators from the entrance into this tournament, the first round had the matchup set to do battle with Shadow's Ninja Star. How did this weapon affect the flag set for the first round of tournament matchups? Well, you did get to start with Shadow and his natural throw command, which made a very powerful character to include in your final party, as well as a +5 vigor and +5 speed stat boost to all characters, but this came with some caveats. The reward for winning the Coliseum match was a very powerful status effect auto image, which had the consequence of de-emphasizing the need to find calmness protection, since image would be cast on the party to start tier 3 on Final Kefka. Every single runner that took part in a first round matchup did obtain this reward. Since Shadow is a cold-blooded assassin, the objective quest of letting Sid die would also yield a high tier item. Unfortunately, none of the runners in the first round decided to go for this quest because they already had enough offense to start out with. Due to the nature of Shadow's lone wolf qualities, the no split party XP flag was turned off, meaning that experience was split amongst the living party members at the end of battles with an XP multiplier of 8. This meant that parties of 2 would get XP times 4 per character, parties of 3 would get XP times 2.6 repeating per character, and full parties of 4 would only get XP times 2 per character, compared to the Ultros League non-split XP times 3 per character. So this meant you'll probably be gaining less XP per battle than used to in racing standards. We saw many runners employ a 3 or 2 and even in some cases a 1-person party strategy while going through the seed in the early going. Additionally, Shadow's reputation as a thief made it such that shopkeepers wouldn't buy the goods that he acquired, so starting with 50,000 GP and a 10x GP multiplier meant that you'd have to follow the lore line of Shadow slitting his mama's throat for a nickel in order to purchase items at the shop, since everything sold for 0. Lastly, YNPC being set to remove allowed runners to sequence break into other characters' checks, since the stealthy Shadow doesn't care about rando logic, and the no free progression flag was set to on since the ninja always had to earn his keep. With these options in mind, how did the matches fare? Let's go over them individually. Mark was the leader of the gladiators after his impressive first place showing with Terra's Sword, but how did that translate into Shadow's Ninja Star going up against Magre? We started with Gao having tools and runic along with Umaro, who is usually strong for a Coliseum play. However, both runners had trouble, with Magre getting an enemy that had Reflect, which meant an easy wipe to a magic cast, and Mark being petrified by Gecko Rex as well as being defeated by a ninja. Prior to going to the Coliseum, Magre did an early sequence break into Mount Zozo that yielded not only an experience egg and a chest, but the reward was Setzer, which allowed him to acquire Gogo at Daryl's Tomb for his last character. Contrast this with Mark, who not only lost time due to an unfortunate wipe at the second boss of the Floating Continent with Magimaster after a lengthy fight, with the first boss being Doomgaze for a nightmare-fueled Floating Continent, but Mark also last locations his 5th character at the Opera House after getting Celeste on the Veldt. Magre took advantage of this out-of-logic play as well as Merton protection and secured a 1:19:05 to 1:30:59 victory over Mark to advance to round 2 in the upper bracket. Next up was Drulith, who is in Megalixir versus Nobody War, who was in Potion for the Ultros League last season, but this match was much closer than it appeared on paper. We started off with Edgar and Mog, who had Steal and Capture respectively, really leaning into the theme of the seed. Both runners also took the same opening route, even being eerily in sync at the 5-minute mark. Both also had trouble at the Coliseum with a mutual death on Scullion for Drulith and a Petrify from Exo-Ray for Nobody War, who spent significantly longer there to get the auto image status after striking out on those Thunder Shield from Scullion fights, which gave Drew enough time to complete the Floating Continent, although Nobody War had gone to Lone Wolf right away to grab an Esper and Gogo at Kefka at Narsh, as well as buying the Tizen Thief Esper. While Drulith then ran into a series of characters, Nobody War decided to sequence break into the Magitech Factory after the Floating Continent, a popular combination of multi-check areas due to the 8 total bosses, which is 2/3 of the total required for the skip. Getting Cyan at the end of that check meant even more divergence, as Nobody War followed Cyan's checks for the rest of his Espers, and Drew followed the Figure Bros, Sabin and Edgar, for the rest of his Espers. Nobody War was the first runner into Kefka's Tower, but the boss gauntlet gave him much more trouble than Drulith, whose gaggle of characters allowed him to pump out more damage, and these runners were neck and neck, stepping on the switches within mere seconds of one another. Drulith's Fire 3 allowed him to take a bigger lead on Tier 1 than the Fire Skeins and Fire 2 for Nobody War. Even though Nobody War had a Ragnarok swinging Edgar and Throgo, it was not enough to make up up the difference as the battle waged on. Drulith's 127.54, in spite of losing Shadow on Tier 3, was slightly better than Nobody War's 129.59 due to Drulith's magical damage output from Mog and Terra. Dr. DT and Boo's match started off with Strago capture and Go-Go along with an ice shield for dried meat in the Coliseum. Both runners went in wildly different directions, with Dr. DT choosing Zone Eater and the Floating Continent, which had 2 characters, Realm with Lore and Setzer, to go along with an Experience Egg as the reward from Floating Continent 2, while Boo was fighting through the Magitech factory, then the Cave on the Veldt to find Gao before getting so frustrated with the Veldt RNG in the World of Ruin, he hopped over to the World of Balance before finally deciding he had enough and headed to the Floating Continent after what seemed like far too many battles. Although Dr. DT had the upper hand with the earlier Floating Continent play, Kefka's Tower gave both runners some troubles with a wipe to Fun Baba at the Guardian spot, and they felt the wrath of a French vanilla poltergeist using spells like the ever-annoying Stop Blaster, along with Hyperdrive and Ultima from being scaled very high. A clutch safety bit play allowed Dr. DT to get past the wall first, while Boo had to walk back through the tower the normal way with an overloaded party just to get past the spicy one. In the end, Boo's diversion to one of his least favorite checks, along with having to go back through Kefka's Tower a different route, gave Dr. DT the victory with a 1:33.04 time. The seed for Falcon Hit against Fantastodon gave Setzer with Dance and Lock with Runic, but more importantly, a Valiant Knife from the Narsh Weapon Shop reward. Fantastodon decided on a more traditional South Figaro Cave grind, whereas Falcon Hit went with a less traditional dip into the Phoenix Cave, picking up a Flame Shield and Phantom Esper with Cure 3. Although Fantastodon went to Floating Continent first, Falcon Hit's party of 2 meant his characters were stronger for the triple part check, which allowed him to much more quickly dispatch of bosses like Ifrit before Shiva made an appearance and Goddess. However, Fantastodon used YMPC remove on the final part of the Floating Continent, while Falcon Hit squared off against Magimaster, so that catch-up started to look more like mustard. Both runners kept digging in monster in a boxes, including Falcon Hit sequence breaking into Collapsing House to no avail for that Katana Soul, who drops an offering that pairs nicely with Valiant Knife. Fantastodon gambled on an out-of-logic Magitech factory, so he wouldn't have to trudge up to Kefka at Narsh for his 4th character, but got a Dead Marvel Shoes as the 2nd check and an Esper as the 3rd check. Thus, Falcon Hit grabbed the lead with Go-Go and then Realm at Zone Eater. It was a gap he would never relinquish, even though he had to walk through the tower for his skip at the Poltergeist spot, partially due to a brutal series of end cross luck on Fantastodon's Vanilla Doom spot that allowed Falcon Hit to advance with a 1:15.09 to Fantastodon's 1:26.49. The Ficta versus Tournament Admin Double Down match started off with a Dancing Terra and a Tool Strago, so both runners decided to eventually loot the Imperial base after a nice sink in South Figaro at about 9 minutes in. However, only Double Down decided to go through to the end, since the no free progression flag ensured a high tier item at the end. But with the Flame Shield and knowledge of an Experience Egg for sale and World of Balance Albrook for Double Down mean a victory, well, Ficta decided to visit World of Balance Narsh instead with an Illumina as the reward for the Whelk Cave, so he jumped ahead of Double Down, who had some difficulty in the Coliseum because of how wonderful the AI can be when determining what to do with your turns, and had the stronger offense with Terra Illumina instead of Strago's Meteor magic casts. Upon both completing the Floating Continent, it was Ficta's turn to have struggles at the Coliseum between Stereodite using Blaster and going to fight an undead enemy with a weapon that procs insta-kill. The runners then traced each other's footsteps to get a ton of Espers. Double Down went up to Kefka at Narsh for Edgar, while Ficta obtained Realm and Ebbett's Rock. After checking about 4 different spots for a character, Ficta gambled on Zone Eater and was rewarded with Cyan, while Double Down went all the way to the Ancient Castle to get his go mode with Lock, which put Ficta in a lead that he would not relinquish, finishing with a time of 1:13.35 en route to his W. Flurry squared off against Jamian, and they had a starting Umaro and Edgar with Jump, plus a Ragnarok and Fixed Dice as some of the free rewards, so they were off and running with some other great treasure and chests along the way. However, the first set of bosses that our runners decided to take on was a Magimaster at Tritok Cliff, which was a reset out for Flurry, and Doom as the second boss in the first part of the Floating Continent, which took a while for Jamian to take down. Both runners met up for the Edgar loop, but Flurry decided to check the Vanilla Katana Soul spot to nab an offering for those Fixed Dice, while Jamian bypassed it to try his luck with Magimaster at the Tritok spot. Unfortunately, he was unable to take down that boss after 2 tries, with Flurry grabbing the Tzemthi Vesper that allowed him to learn Berserk to finally take down a Magimaster after 4 collective tries between both runners to get his last character first, prior to Jamian getting his last character at Kefka at Narsh. Thus, he was able to take home home the win with a 135-29 over Jamian's 144-55. GB Matt and Green Monkey were given Celeste with Sword Tech and Strega with Capture for their first round matchup, along with two big swords, an Illumina from the Norse Weapon Shop and a Ragnarok from Gal Manor to use straight out of the gate. GB Matt decided to step into Casa del Fuego to find Gogo as Green Monkey went to the floating continent to grab Sabin. After both runners went to the Magitech factory around the same time, GB Matt decided to go to the floating continent, but struggled against Doomgaze, who knocked out half of his party of 4 upon the start of the fight. That put him on the back foot for a while, so he used YMPC remove on the final boss of the check to make up for some of that time, while Green Monkey chased the Sabin checks for his Espers. Both runners grabbed the Tzen Thief Esper for Go mode around the same time, but it was Green Monkey that took the lead with a Magimaster at the Guardian spot, since he had learned the Berserk spell on his party, while GB Matt had to take a reset followed by some grind fights to learn the spell that nullified the magical onslaught from Magimaster. Learning Merton on his 4th character and finding the Katana Soul at a monster in a box for an Atma weapon offering character gave Green Monkey the offensive edge in the final battle as well, finishing with a 119-29 over a 126-03 from GB Matt to move on to the upper bracket in round 2. TheShwantz27 had a plan when going up against Zelfer85 to do the checks that Zelfer does not like doing, so Kefkat Narsh and Magitech 3 was high on the list along with some other free checks. Even though Schwantz did find the Illuminas for sale in World of Ruin Albrook that both Celeste and Sabin as starting characters could use, it did make the early game longer to get enough funds to purchase one with a party of 3 versus Zelfer using a party of 2 for higher levels. The Kefkat Narsh gamble did not pay off, along with Schwantz running into Doomgaze, forgetting to re-equip some damage-increasing relics slowly chewed away at his time. Zelfer also found his characters way before the end of a long minecart ride, and that was enough of a gap to secure a victory with a 113-46 over a 123-03 time from the Schwantz. Jexferox and Ensign Wesley's match gave us Lock Lore and Mog Morph to start, so it was an overloaded Narsh, and Jexferox took the bait for Lone Wolf right away. However, he was unable to defeat the Crane's boss, the Kefkat Narsh, which made him lose some time as Ensign Wesley grabbed the Ragnarok for lock and a W at the Coliseum. Jexferox's slow start continued with a Trolley Coliseum pep-up battle, but he clawed back some time doing a sequence break into Magitech Factory to collect a few Espers and Cyan, while Ensign Wesley struggled to find the shiny rocks, even going as far as to take an extra Edgar character to peek his check, but alas, that was also a character, so he had to go through some of the longer checks for his progression, like Ebbett's Rock, Phonetic's Tower, and finally Phoenix Cave for Go mode. Even though Jexferox was able to pull off the Permamorph on Tier 1 of the final Kefka battle, Ensign Wesley had too big of a lead to get a very slim 121-14 to 122-08 under 1 minute victory in the closest nail-biter of the first round of the Coliseum tournament. The matchup between IB Karma and Turdsman started with Cyan with a decent set of rages and Celeste with GP Rain, and both runners took advantage of an easy Coliseum fight for a Valiant Knife that unfortunately nobody in their party could equip. IB Karma jumped out to an early character lead by grabbing Setsa at Doma Siege, followed by Realm at Daryl's Tomb, while Turdsman took off the Moogle Charm to grind with the Magitech armor on in Cyan's Dream and grabbed 3 quick Espers. IB Karma then unlocked the seed by taking the Esper from the Doomgaze fight to learn Merton, after grabbing a Minerva at the Coliseum and multiple elemental shields from the South Figaro basement, while Turdsman favored using the experience egg that both got in the basement to beef up Celeste and get the Atma weapon reward from one of the free checks online as quickly as possible. Even though Turdsman got his Go mode first, IB Karma was able to utilize the KT skip to leap ahead of his opponent at the statues while Turdsman walked through Kefka's tower. Even though Turdsman had higher levels and more damage output, the time lead in the final dungeon was enough to give IB Karma the victory by slightly more than a minute with final times of 125.34 versus 126.50. Restreamer extraordinaire Saberwolf took on the organizer of the Living Seed Async Taco Mage in a matchup that started with Sabin having his Vanilla Blitz and Celeste with Sword Tech. Taco Mage grabbed some fixed dice from the Norse Weapon Shop and started doing Sabin checks with the higher damage potential, while Saberwolf went straight up to the floating continent. Taco Mage soon followed, and both runners then did the Magitech Factory to yield Realm at the end, but Saberwolf got 4 more characters in a row afterwards before finally getting a good yield of Espers, even going so far as to look at the Tzen Thief at the same time as Taco Mage, whereas his opponent avoided unnecessary progression and got into Kefka's tower first. The string of unlucky rewards meant that Taco Mage was able to secure the 122-13 to 136-53 victory. victory. The Hefe and Javinator match started with Sabin Rage and Strago Control. Hefe took his party down to one character with Shadow in the South Figaro Basement and Imperial Camp, while equipping the Cursed Ring to learn X-Zone and give him a huge XP boost early in the scene. Meanwhile, Javinator used YMPC Remove to access Mount Zozo to grab an Esper with Fire 3. However, both runners ran into some nasty encounters, with Hefe wiping to one of the Imperial Camp fights and Javinator running into a level magic party on the trek for the floating continent. The extra levels on Shadow plus an earlier Coliseum visit giving Strago dual-wielding Ragnaroks allowed Hefe to take down fights much faster than Javinator, while both took the same path and were even fighting the same boss 33 minutes into the race. At 51 minutes into the race, both runners were looking for their last character as Hefe dipped into the Burning House to recruit Locke, and Javinator grabbed Cyan at Ebbets Rock. In the end, though, the extra levels and dual-wielding sword user for Hefe allowed him to take the 115-27 to 124-37 win over Javinator. Ultros League champion Kurgzy squared off against Moogle's first tournament runner-up Pootscooty, and the seed gave them a Sabin Health plus Go-Go start. Pootscooty went to the floating continent right away, and Kurgzy follows Sabin's checks where he found Terra at Barren Falls and Stray Cat in the Phantom Train for Terra's rage ability. However, he had to reset out due to a poltergeist at the end of the train and potentially losing that powerful Cat Scratch ability. Thankfully, it was a default rage for Terra, so it just ended up being a time loss. Pootscooty continued to do the multi-part checks of the Magitech Factory and then Cyan's Dream, eventually acquiring final Kefka requirements first, while Kurgzy racked up extra characters which made his bosses more difficult. However, he had the higher levels with a party of 3 versus a party of 4 for Pootscooty, and more powerful Fire 3 in both 3 spells versus only Tier 2 versions of those for Pootscooty. Both runners had trouble with Ifrit the first time around and needed to equip some fire protection as Pootscooty entered the final battle with a 2-minute lead. However, that lead evaporated as both runners are basically synced going into Tier 3 due to the increased firepower of Kurgzy's party. Eventually, the damage output from Kurgzy allowed him to finish with a time of 122.21, just over a minute ahead of Pootscooty's 122.53 in an epic come-from-behind nail-biter. Moogle's first tournament champion Gar squared off against One Free Fits in the last match on the bracket, but the first one to be scheduled during the week. A start of Gao captured GP Rain with Cyan and Steel meant our runners were looking for dried meat, and after finding it in the airship shop, Gar quickly started on Gao's checks to get a pair of Espers, whereas One Free Fits did some additional looting. This extra chest gathering allowed One Free Fits to grab an experience egg from the Coliseum, whereas Gar did not have the item to trade for it. After leaving the Coliseum near the same time, Gar went through Cyan's Dream to find Mog, and One Free Fits found Sabin at the Cave on the Veldt. The runners didn't lean into these early characters until towards the end of the seed, where Gar got Fenrir from Lone Wolf and One Free Fits got Edgar at the Phantom Train. With Gar getting Go mode first, but not having enough bosses to skip straight away, One Free Fits ended up right behind Gar at the statues after getting to skip in at that spot. The experience egg with the 2 Atma weapons for One Free Fits carried enough damage to overcome the slight time deficit, and he grabbed the victory 114.26 to Gar's 117.28. Let's dive into the top 5 plays of round 1, starting with some favorable Coliseum AI for both Hefe and Jexvarox, with their characters using X-Zone for an easy victory to gain the image status for their party. And at the number 4 spot is Ficta, who is looking for something to make his offense a little bit more potent and decided to sequence break into the collapsing house by removing the NPC out of the doorway and finding Katana Soul in one of the 2 possible monster in a boxes there. For number 3, Dr. DT using incredible game knowledge with a smidge of luck to steal a Mega Elixir from Final Kefka in order to heal himself back up after the Mad Clown casted Falling One. Speaking of luck, number 2 spot had Flurry 14 without any instant death spells, so he relied on the Scimitar's proc of Cleave to remove Long Arm from the fight on Tier 1. And in at number 1 is Jexvarok pulling off the Permamorph for his Mog after Tier 1, so the Moogle could be doing double damage for the rest of the final battle. Of course, there's the other side of the coin with top 5 fails, and we'll start with some horrific Coliseum AI choices, with Jexvarox's lore user choosing Pep Up instead of something that's actually useful for a reset, along with Double Down's float casts twice, then fight using a weapon that the enemy absorbs, and finally, when it decides to cast something useful, Meteor, his character's out of MP. Wah, wah, wah. In at number 4 is something we've all done before. IB Karma has the throw command, but there is one item that you need to be careful of when throwing: the heal rod, since it targets yourself instead of the enemies, and no, this doesn't heal your character. Sorry, Shadow. In at number 3 is a triple kill on Ensign Wesley at the start of Tier 3 after getting brutalized by an opening Merton from sleep, which is never something fun to recover from. For the number 2 spot is a nasty poltergeist fight in the Dr. DT versus Boo matchup, where both runners had to take multiple stabs at this French vanilla statue, where we saw a hyperdrive and Ultima and Stop Blaster bullying whatever party was thrown at the spicy chicken. Lastly, in at number 1 is a bout of horrible luck for Fantastodon at the Vanilla Doom spot with a full party freeze, followed by a single freeze on the only living character later on in the fight. You best be waiting around for a long time to thaw out. For round 2 of the Coliseum, the Armory has given us Setzer's Dice as a flag set for our battles. The global stat adjustment is +5 Vigor and +5 Stamina to all characters, along with a Coliseum reward of 3 high-tier items. You'll be needing to pray to the RNGesus, however, as these round 2 matchups will be highly seed dependent, as there are lots of randomness within these flags. Character stats can vary wildly at 65 to 140% of vanilla, and the commands are also just random with Magitech and Shock on the table. Shops are random tiered, and the prices of items in shop are completely random from 0 through 64k, so we could get lucky with some cheap, high-powered goodies, or have to struggle with really expensive consumables. Chests are random scaled, meaning the chests get better with each one open, and each chest is identical for both runners no matter which chest is open. So for instance, the 10th chest is the same for both of the runners no matter which one it is. For magic, the Espers can have 0 through 5 spells. Summons are a random MP cost between 1 and 128, and they are equipable by a random set of 6 to 12 characters per Esper. Lastly is battles being random bosses instead of shuffled bosses, with random ability scaling instead of element ability scaling. So we can encounter multiple Flame Eater in a seed, and instead of Fire 3, it could use Ice 3 or Bolt 3, or even a non-elemental high-powered spell like Grand Train, depending upon its level. Also remember that since bosses can be fought multiple times, only the first instance of a boss defeat counts towards your total for the Kefka Tower skip. So if you end up killing Leader 4 times, only one of them will count towards your 12 total bosses, since it's unique boss kills. This is going to be a tough flag set to practice, as the statue bosses are probably going to be much more difficult than Final Kefka, but it will really bring out the game knowledge of the runners with this injection of reacting to things on the fly. Well, that's it for the round 1 recap. Can't wait to see what exciting things our runners get into with the second round of the Coliseum, as both the upper and lower bracket have some incredible matchups that I, for one, cannot wait to watch. And we're also starting Chupon's Pit. Those runners will be using the Shadows Ninja Star flag sets and hopefully learning some strategies based on the races here. I'll be back at the end of the second week for another recap. I've been TheShwantz27. Until next time.